Well, hey, and welcome to Faith and Reason. My name is Chip Mitchell. I serve as the lead evangelist for the Greater Philadelphia Church of Christ, and this is a series on faith and reason. And why am I doing this series? Well, there are a lot of people that are out there that are struggling with the idea of Jesus. Did the things that are recorded in the scriptures actually happen? Is this mythology? Did these things take place? Is there any proof of these things outside of the Bible? A lot of times people want to discredit anything that is in the biblical text from being evidence or being able to present a fact about Jesus and his deity, his life and death and resurrection. And quite frankly, that's a very poor argument for a couple of reasons. There are, if you take New Testament scholarship that's out there, historians, doctoral historians, these are the people who have many digits after their names. In that community, both the atheists and the agnostic community that is out there, they do not disregard biblical texts as non-historical writings. They just don't. They credit them with history. They do have problems with a lot of particular texts, but there are some texts within the Bible that there is 100% agreement on. In both communities, the atheist community, the agnostic community, and the theist community. But these are historians. These are not social media sensations. But today, what I wanted to do is just present to you some things that are true and reasonable. And I also wanted to make it clear that I don't think people understand that this idea of wrestling with faith and doubt is not new. It was something that they dealt with in the first century. And when you look at the Bible, in particular, there's a story that I want to start off with in Acts 26. Now, we're going to talk about non-biblical evidences that support the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are going to get to that, but I want you to understand a couple of things. One, that this idea of finding faith, this idea of doubting this walk with God, this Jesus and what Jesus is calling us to is not new. Paul had to deal with that. And I thought I'd read a little story of Paul as he's dealing with two officials, one's a king and one's a Roman official, about his faith. And they just don't believe it. So I want you to understand that in our 21st century, that you are going to face some of the same challenges that they faced in the first century, where you're presenting your faith and people not believing it. They had the same struggle with it in the first century. But I also want to equip you with, how did Paul deal with these types of situations in the first century? Because we can mimic that. So the best way to do that is let's just read Acts and see how he faced it, but how he dealt with it. And then we can glean from that and then go to build a case of evidence, literally, as he did. And so we're picking up here in Acts chapter 26, beginning in verse 1. And he's speaking to King Agrippa. This is in the lineage of the Herodians. And he's speaking to King Agrippa as well as Festus, who is a Roman official, and Paul has been arrested because in preaching the gospel message, he caused a bit of a riot, and the Jews were having a problem. So Paul gets arrested, and now while he's arrested, he gets an opportunity to come before Agrippa and the Roman official Festus and basically tell a story. And we're going to pick up here, and we're going to learn some things that I think will help us in our faith as we're presenting a case for Christ. And if maybe you're not presenting a case for Christ, but you're trying to figure out, do you believe in this Jesus? I want you to understand that here's a story that you're in good company, if you will, that there were people that felt like you may feel not believing him. So we'll pick up here in Acts chapter 26, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Then Agrippa said to Paul, 'You have permission to speak for yourself.'" Now, Paul's about to speak. So Paul motions with his hand and began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews." Listen how he starts off. He says, "King Agrippa," he says, "you know what? I consider myself fortunate." Notice he's not adversarial. He's not condemning or condescending. He's like, "Look, man, I'm fortunate." He's being very respectful. "I'm fortunate to be before you. And I'm making my defense against what? All the accusations of the Jews. And especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies." Notice what he says. There are Jewish customs. Their faith had certain customs and traditions. But he also says controversies. So there's always controversies amongst faith. There always has been, and there always will be. He says, "Therefore, listen to what he says. I beg you to listen to me patiently." So he's just asking respectfully. He's begging, "Please listen to me patiently." Verse 4, "The Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify." So Paul's like, it's not like my life is unknown to the individuals that are accusing me. He says, "If they are willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee." Now, what does this mean? This means that Paul was really a theologian when it came to the Old Testament scriptures. He knew them like the back of his hand. He was a Pharisee. He was a teacher of the people. He was well-trained historically with Israel and their history, well-trained with the prophecies that are found, and well-trained in the biblical texts from the Old Testament. He is one of the most scholarly known individuals of his day, and they all know it. This was a fact. Verse 6, "And now it is because of my hope and what God has promised our ancestors that I'm on trial today." So what is he talking about? He says, the reason I'm on trial is because I have the same hope that God has promised our ancestors. So he's making reference to the prophecies in the Old Testament. And he's saying, my hope is the same hope as our ancestors that had promises that were from God. These were prophetic promises from God that our ancestors hoped in. And he says, and I hope in. Verse 7, "This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night." So the bottom line is the ancestors hoped. Paul in the first century hoped. They placing their hope in something. Let me tell you something. Everybody is placing their hope in something. Paul is saying himself, the prophets, and the ancestors, they placed their hopes in the prophecies or the promises of God. But those that don't believe in God, they're placing their hope in something as well. Both groups, those that believe in God and believe in the testimony of Jesus, and those that don't believe in God and don't believe in the testimony, everybody's placing their hope in something. The question is, what are you placing your hope in? So what are you placing? And Paul is he says, hey, myself and my ancestors, we placed our hopes in the promises of God. Verse 7, "This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night." King Agrippa, it is because of what? This hope that these Jews are accusing me. So he's saying the reason I'm on trial is because these Jews, they have a hope. I have a hope. It's in the promises of God, but there's a discrepancy in the promises of God and their fulfillment. Paul doesn't agree with what the Jews are saying with regards to those prophecies, and the Jews are not in agreement with Paul as he interprets those prophecies. Verse 8, "Why should any of you," now watch what he says, "why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?" Here we are. Paul is saying that the promises that God made, one of them is that God was going to raise the dead. And then he goes on, verse 9. He says, I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. See, Paul, prior to becoming a Christian, hated those that followed Jesus of Nazareth. And he opposed, notice what he says, I too was convinced that I would do all that was possible to oppose the name, the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. Verse 10, at that, and that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the Lord's people in prison. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So he even says, folks in jail, I was for it. I put them in jail. Not only that, some of them were put to death, and I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. Well, what is this idea of blaspheming? He was getting them to denounce Jesus as Lord, to denounce the divine nature of Jesus. That's what he did. Why? Because he disagreed with the teaching. He disagreed. And watch what he says. He says, I was obsessed with persecuting them, that I even hunted them down in foreign cities. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and the commission of the chief priests. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. So Paul is making his way, going to Damascus. What is he doing? He's looking for these so-called Christians or followers of Jesus of Nazareth. For what reason? To persecute them, to have them prosecuted, and in some cases put to death. Well, while he's on this road, what happens? A bright light from heaven, and he gets an experience with the risen Jesus Christ. And he asks, who are you? And he says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up, stand on your feet. I have appeared. Here it is. I have appeared to you to appoint you what? As a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to do what? To open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive what? Forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Verse 19. So he says, so then, King Agrippa, so he explains this experience he has. He explains this bright light, this voice in Jesus. And he says, so King Agrippa, guess what? I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in Judea, and then to the Gentiles I preached that they should what? Repent, turn to God, and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day. So I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I am saying nothing what? Beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. So now in verse 22, he's saying, look, I was obedient to what Jesus asked me to do. I went and did it. And notice what he says here. I'm not saying anything beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. Paul is giving great credibility to everything that he's teaching and doing to what? The prophets and Moses. That's the entire Old Testament. He's saying that everything that he's teaching and doing comes from the Old Testament. Verse 23, that the Messiah would what? Suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. So he brings up this idea, the Messiah would suffer and be the first to rise from the dead. And at this point, verse 24, Festus, now here's the Roman official, interrupted Paul's defense. You are out of your mind, Paul, he shouted. Your great learning, now notice he recognizes him as a scholar. Your great learning, he says, is driving you insane. So now he speaks about the resurrection. He speaks about the prophecies. And Festus is like, dude, I've heard enough. You're out of your mind. Verse 25, Paul responds. He says, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus, Paul replied. What I'm saying is what? True and reasonable. Paul is making his point that the things that he's presenting are true and reasonable. Now watch what he says. He says the king is familiar with these things. Now he makes reference to the king. Why? He's going back to King Agrippa. He goes, why? Because King Agrippa was Jewish. He said King Agrippa he says the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Now, Paul lays out some things that are pretty amazing here after he's interrupted. He says, first of all, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus, he replied. What I'm saying is true and reasonable. And then he brings in the king and he says, well, King Agrippa, you know that I'm not crazy, basically. He says, I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice. In other words, these things, as he says, were not done in some corner. And then he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Why? King Agrippa grew up reading the Old Testament. But what we see in this interaction is a few things. We see that Paul is making his true and reasonable. His faith is reasonable for three basic reasons. And these are the things that I want to present to you that are my argument for the evidence for the life, death, deity, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Number one, what we see Paul doing is offering in Acts 26 the test of the uniqueness of prophecy. The test of the uniqueness of prophecy. Notice what he says in Acts 26, verse 7. He says, this is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. So he's making reference to the prophecies from the Old Testament. Some of these are 1,500 years old. And it's a test of unique prophecies in that this is not mythology. Mythology are stories that have no eyewitnesses to the prophetic nature of them, when they were promised that they were happen, or when they were fulfilled. The test of prophecy with Christianity is unique in that the promises had eyewitnesses when the promises were made. We have archaeological evidences of that. We have textual evidences of that. And then the fulfillment of it, we have eyewitnesses for the fulfillment of the test of prophecy. And that test of prophecy is unique in that it's spanning 1,500 years. Over 40 writers or authors, and all telling a story with a promise from the God Yahweh. And it's unique in that these are not mythological stories. These were prophets that were human beings that folks knew, that lived and breathed, and the fulfillment of it was fulfilled with the eyewitness testimony, both biblical and non-biblical. So the first thing he presents in his argument is the test of the uniqueness of prophecy, and we're going to talk about that. The second thing he talks about is eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. Now notice what he talks about when Jesus appears to him. Jesus says, I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see. So now it's this idea of eyewitnesses, personal testimonies to the fulfillment of the prophecies of old. So that's the second thing. The third thing that we have is all to see. Paul says to Festus and King Agrippa, he says, I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, speaking to King Agrippa, because it was not done in a corner. In other words, this was not some secret. This is not some fairy tale or myth that no one could see. He says, these things were done not in a corner. They were done for all to see. So we're going to look at these three areas, and I'm going to give you evidence of the death, deity, life, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let's start with all to see. So let's talk about this. There's no other figure that has impacted history like Jesus. Yet today, he's often seen as a mythological character whose legend increased over time. That's what people generally say. Well, let's look at some first and second century evidence outside of the Bible that talks about this Jesus. Josephus. Josephus is a first century historian, well known in history. The atheist historian, the agnostic historian, all agree Josephus wrote in the first century. They also all agree that Josephus was a little, he was biased at times. Whatever the wave or the wind that would keep him safe, that's where he would go. But his writings, his testimonies are used as historical evidences. And what they do is they compare it to what is known and what is not known, and they can understand where he's exaggerating or making things up in such a way that they're not. There is a particular controversial writing that he wrote where supposedly he said this guy was the Son of God. And everyone knows that that is not what Josephus wrote, but somehow, some way in his writings, one of the copies that probably some Christian changed what he wrote to put that in, because we know that Josephus did not believe that. But when you look at some of his other writings, he does have a writing here that is a quote that is more in line with what Josephus wrote. And here it is in the first century. He says, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had reported wonders. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. This is a powerful statement from a first century historian that falls in line with Josephus's beliefs. This man witnessed the destruction of the temple. He wrote also about Jesus's brother, James. He said his brother James was put to the sword, and he says, James, the brother of Jesus. So he makes reference to Jesus in these two specific areas. He did not like the Christians in some of his writings, but this is in line. And notice what he talks about. He talks about him as being a wise man, a teacher, that he was virtuous and good, that many people followed him. We know that this is accurate because Jews and Gentiles did ascribe to this idea of being a disciple. He makes mention of Pilate condemning him to die. He also says he was crucified. The other thing he says is that some of these disciples reported that he appeared to them. Notice he didn't say all of them. But some of his disciples, they reported they had appeared to him after the crucifixion. That doesn't mean he believed it. It just said that's what they were saying. We know that to be true by other first and second century historians. Bar Serapion. Here's a first century. This is, again, a first century individual who was writing a letter. He was a philosopher writing a letter to his son, and he speaks about three philosophers. One was Socrates, and then he speaks about Jesus. And watch what he says about Jesus. He says, What advantage did the Jews gain from executing who? Their King Jesus. It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. Well, what's he talking about? The destruction of the temple. He didn't necessarily see, as we see in the biblical narrative, the separation between Christians and Jews. He says God justly avenged these three men as he talks about these three philosophers. In other words, when you do bad things to these individuals, bad things come your way. Talks about, but Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. In other words, the statues that were out there representing him. But notice what he says about Jesus. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. So what is he recognizing? That this Jesus lived, this Jesus was condemned, he was killed, and he says but after his death, he lived on how? Through the teaching in which he had given. We know from Matthew 28, Jesus says, teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. Again, a first century writer outside of the Bible, giving credence to things that we see in the biblical narrative. Jesus lived, he was alive. What about this resurrection? Well, here's a archaeological evidence that is document. It's a stone tablet that has been found in the first century, and it's dated to the first century. It's called the Nazarene inscription. This was found years ago, spent over 8 years in court because they were saying, well, where is this from? Is this really true? And they had to get all kinds of peer reviews, scientific evidence. And when they did all the research, when they got it out of court, it was like, this is authentic. And what does it say? Claudius, the emperor, he was emperor from 41 to 54. What does he do? He puts out an edict, and this is a Nazarene script. And this is a strong piece of extra biblical evidence of Christ's resurrection had already been announced long after he was raised. And this is pretty amazing because what does it say? This was a Nazarene script that was placed in Galilee. And what did it say? It basically says, hey, look, if anyone is captured robbing bodies from tombs, you will face strict penalties, death. And it's like, are you kidding me? It says anybody captured robbing bodies from burial places. Now, you got to understand this. Who robs dead bodies? Nobody robs dead bodies. Nobody. Who would want to rob a dead body? What do? They rob jewelry, gold, and treasures in tombs. Nobody's robbing bodies. But what happened? Well, there was a disruption in the Roman Empire over this dead guy that was claimed to have risen from the dead. And because they couldn't find the body, many, as the Bible narrative says, that, the disciples stole the body. And here we have archaeological evidence from the first century from the emperor saying, if you get caught robbing a body from its burial place, you will face death. Powerful evidence that this is not some made-up story, but that people in the first century were facing something they had never faced before, a resurrected Jesus. It's just blow away. This is non-biblical evidence that the stories that are written in the scriptures are true and trustworthy. What about some of the other second century? You continue this journey in this, Thales. This guy, he wrote in the first century, 52 to something. And this guy was talking about the death of Jesus. And he was making reference to the Passover when he died on that Friday. And you know what he says? He has a serious problem with Christians. He doesn't believe Jesus is the Son of God. And he's a fierce defender against this idea of Christianity. And he's defending it because people were saying, well, obviously he had to be something because when he died, the whole land turned dark. Well, Thales, guess what he does? He says the only reason when this guy died that the whole area turned dark was because of an eclipse. He makes reference to the darkness when he died, and he makes reference to the earthquake. But he was saying it's only because it was an eclipse. Now, the problem is when we go all the way back, we can trace where the moon and the sun were in 33 AD. The moon was on the wrong side of the planet. So inadvertently, he gives proof about what the Bible says, that when Jesus was executed on the cross, darkness covered the land. And Thales, from the first century, is quoted as making reference to the earthquake and darkness over the land. Tacitus, here's an individual who really had a problem with Christians. You know, Nero winds up persecuting them for blaming them for burning a portion of Rome. And Tacitus makes reference to Nero saying, hey, he blamed it on the Christians. But Tacitus also gives credit to these Christians come from this guy, Jesus Christos, and he says that Pontius Pilate was the one who ordered him to be crucified. And in addition to that, Tacitus says that these people, he hated these Christians, and he says that they sprung this great thing after. He called it a superstition after the resurrection of Jesus. Well, what's he making reference to? The superstition that in his mind was that Jesus had risen from the dead. Pliny the Younger, he talks about these Christians. He said they would get together on a special day of the week, and they would come together making vows and commitments to this God. And he says, and then they would sing songs to this Jesus or this Christ guy as if he were a God. So we see the idea of deity, we see the idea of life, we see the idea of death, and we see the idea of supposed resurrection. And we're seeing this all from first and second century officials and historians from that time period. You know, Celsus, this one is a blow-away. He came later, 170 AD. He quotes over 80 passages from the New Testament. He literally quotes them, but he was not a believer. Listen at what he writes about Jesus. Now, this is 170 AD. He says, Jesus had come from a village in Judea. Here he is. This is outside evidence. He came from a village from Judea. We see that in the Bible. And he was the son of a poor Jewish who had gained her living by the work of her own hands. We know that Jesus came from a poor family. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband. What does that mean? In other words, the husband was wanting to divorce her. That is interesting. How does he know this? The husband wanted to divorce her, who was a carpenter by trade. He gives credit that Joseph was a carpenter. Jesus was a carpenter. On being convicted of what? Adultery. And he even names a soldier, Pantheria. He says, well, you know, Mary, this mother, if you will, of Jesus, was adulterous, and she got pregnant by some soldier, and that's why her husband, as we know, Joseph, was going to what? Divorce her. And we read the scriptures, the Bible says that Joseph was going to quietly divorce her. For what reason? For adultery. Why? She was pregnant, and they had not consummated the marriage. So this guy is giving credence to what is written in the scriptures, being thus driven away by her husband. And notice what he says, and wandering about, how? In disgrace. She gave birth to who? Jesus. And what does he call him? A bastard. Why does he call him a bastard? Because Jesus or Mary was pregnant out of wedlock. That's what, this was not done in secret. Remember what Paul said? Jesus, now watch this. Jesus, on the account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. Well, where did Mary and Joseph go? They went to Egypt. Why did they go to Egypt? They were running from Herod. Why? Herod wanted Jesus dead. And the Bible says they went to Egypt. Now, here is Celsus, 170 AD, 77 AD. He's telling the exact same story. Now, notice what he said. They went to Egypt. While they were there, he, speaking of Jesus, acquired what? Magical powers, which the Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at the possessing of these powers, and on the strength of them, gave himself out to be what? A god. Here it is, the deity of God. This idea, he's giving confirmation that Jesus, on the power of this stuff that he gained, how did he gain these powers? Well, he gives credit to Egypt. He said he learned these sorcery, these magical powers in Egypt, and he came back using these powers. Now we have an outside individual giving reference to Jesus working miracles. Now he says he's able to do it. Why? He got the magical powers from the Egyptians. And notice what he says, on them strength, he gave himself out to be a god. Here is the deity. Now this guy lays out Jesus's birth. He lays out the controversy that surrounded Jesus's birth. He lays out they went to Egypt. He lays out the magical powers that Jesus possessed that we don't call magical, we call miracles. And then he also lays out the deity aspect of Jesus. These are all outside of the Bible. We talked about Josephus, the Talmud. Now, this is 300 years, so you're talking 4th century. The Talmud, this is a Jewish, the Mishnah, writing about Jesus. What do they do? They call him a heretic. They said he was divisive and led many people astray. He was worthy of stoning. They talk about his miracles. They say the only reason why he was able to do miracles is because he used sorcery. These are all outside sources that tell the gospel story of Jesus Christ. They tell it, and they're all outside stories. What do we know about the test of prophecy? Let's talk about that. Paul, when he makes his defense between Herod and Festus, he talks about the prophecies. He says, this is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. Well, what are these prophecies? I mean, there's a ton of prophecies. You know, the Old Testament contains well over 400 prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. Well over 400. A professor named Peter Stoner, he worked with 600 students to figure out what does that probability look like. The result was 1 in 100 and a bunch 20 some odd zeros. I mean, it's just an astronomical probability that just 8 of the prophecies were fulfilled. Another individual, Lee Strobel, an atheist turned Christian, he decided to figure out what that calculation would look like. He said, imagine if you took 1.5 inch squares, little tile squares, and covered the entire earth, only places where there was land. And on one of those tiles, you just painted a red mark underneath it. And you cover the entire earth with it, wherever there's land, and you let someone wander around for a lifetime on 7 continents, and you would have them permit to bend down one time to pick up one of those pieces of tile. And he says, what are the odds of them picking up the one red one? He's going, that's the probability of just 8 of the prophecies being fulfilled. When Paul was making his defense, he makes reference to the scriptures. And there's 3 scriptures you can look at for just 9 of the prophecies, just 9 of them. You can look, you know these scriptures, Psalms 22, Isaiah 53, and Psalm 16. In those 3 passages, there are 9 fulfilled prophecies of Jesus. In Psalms 22, which was written 1,000 years before Jesus was crucified, 1,000 years. What does it talk about? It talks about his hands and his feet being pierced, specifically being pierced. We see that in Psalms 22, verse 16. We see the fulfillment of that in John chapter 20, verse 25. We see that the Messiah's bones will not be broken. A person's legs were usually broken after being crucified to speed up their death. We see that prophesied in Psalms 22, verse 17. The fulfillment of it, John 19:33. We see that men will cast lots for the Messiah's clothing. See that in Psalms 22, verse 18. The fulfillment of that in Matthew 27:35. In Isaiah 53, this passage is known as the suffering servant prophecy. This prophecy was written 700 years before Jesus was born. Isaiah provides some details of his life and his death. We see that the Messiah will be rejected. In Isaiah 53, verse 3, we see the fulfillment of that in Luke 13:34. We see the Messiah will be killed as a vicarious sacrifice for the sins of his people. We see that in Isaiah 53, verses 5 and 9. We see the fulfillment of that in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21. The Messiah will be silent in front of his accusers. Isaiah 53, verse 7, 1 Peter 2:23. The Messiah will be buried with the rich. Isaiah 59 or Isaiah 53, verse 9, Matthew 27, 57 and 60, we see the fulfillment. The Messiah will be with criminals in his death. Isaiah 53:12, the fulfillment in Mark 15:27. In addition to that, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we see that in Psalm 16, verse 10. For he says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay." These are just 9 fulfilled prophecies in 3 passages. There are well over 400 prophecies in the Old Testament that speak very clearly and very specifically to Jesus' life, his deity, his death, and his resurrection. Not just these prophecies, but we also have a foreshadowing, whether it's the story of Abraham, the story of the Passover with Moses, blood on the door and death passing by, the story of Joseph, a son that was begotten and yet saved the nation. There's so many foreshadowing stories, Abraham, his son Isaac. They are all speaking of the coming of the Messiah. These prophecies, both when they first were made, we have archaeological evidences of these places and these events and eyewitnesses there. And then we have eyewitnesses in the first century for prophecies that span from 1500 to 700 to 1,000 years prior. We see the fulfillment of them. And Paul, when he was making his defense, he made it very clear to both Festus and Agrippa, these things were promised, and these are the things we had hoped for. And now they have come true. And then we see the eyewitness testimony. This last one is the eyewitness testimony of Paul. And you may go, well, wait, you're using the Bible here. Well, there's something you should know. The historical community, I'm talking about scholars, folks that are professors in universities. They have PhD degrees in New Testament theology and history. When they look at the Bible, they give credit to 7 books of Paul's: 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon, Galatians, and Romans. They feel like those 7 books are authentic, they are verified, they've been tested, and they are true. They also understand that these books, like 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians, they came around 40 to 45 AD, that these were the texts as they were written in that time period. So you're talking just a few years after the resurrection of Jesus. These are passages that the atheists and the agnostic theologians, these are people with PhDs, all attest these are true letters from Paul. So when you read this, you've got to understand that the skeptic or the critics in the community validate these texts as historical, accurate, and true from Paul. They may not believe what, but they're like, these are true. That's powerful. And in 1 Corinthians 15, watch what Paul does. In verse 3, he says, what I received, I pass on to you. Now, this is very interesting. When he says this phrase, for what I receive, I pass on to you, the skeptical or critical community that have PhD degrees, they all attest, 99% of them, that when Paul says, what I receive, I pass on to you as the first appointment, what he's about to quote, they believe were creeds from the early Christians. These are creeds that predate even Paul's conversion. They believe that these came literally months after the death of Jesus. So this is powerful. So when they look at Paul, they go, these writings are about 40 AD. This is a 20-year period prior to the resurrection of Jesus. That's when this is written. 20 years. That's blow away. There is nothing in ancient writings that comes remotely close to this. 20-year period. And watch what he says. And he says that what he's about to say is a quote from possibly months after the resurrection. And notice what he says. This is of first importance, that what? Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures. What does he give credence to? The scriptures. That he was buried, and that he raised on the third day, according to what? The scriptures. And that he appeared to who? Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living. So in other words, when Paul's writing this, he's like, man, I've talked to most of these people. I've interacted with eyewitnesses. The skeptic says, what he's writing, this is authentically from Paul. And Paul is saying, I've spoken to the people that have seen him, most of whom are still living. So he knew these people, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James. Who's James? The brother of Jesus. Then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So what is he getting at? These are the eyewitness testimonies. What he's saying is, myself, the apostles, Cephas, James, we were eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. He said, we saw it. The skeptic goes, what Paul's writing here is authentically written by Paul. And Paul is saying, this really happened. Here are some of those historians. Gerd, he's an atheist New Testament professor. What does he say? The elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians, he's talking about 1 Corinthians 15, fall into the time between 30 and 33. Michael, another atheist professor in Birmingham, what does he say? He says it goes back to at least to what Paul was taught when he was converted, a couple of years after the crucifixion. So he's putting this, what he learned here was a couple of years after the crucifixion. Very clear, very clear. Then we have AJM, and what does he say? He's a non-Christian New Testament professor in Munich. He says one is right to speak of the earliest times here, most probably in the first half of the 30s. They all attest. These are atheists, non-Christians, that what is written in 1 Corinthians 15 is really what Paul wrote and what Paul was claiming his experience. Whenever you have atheists, agnostic, folks that aren't believers attesting to it, that's called legitimate evidence. Legitimate. Paul also writes in Galatians, I remind you, the atheist, the agnostic, they all believe that Galatians is one of those 7 books that legitimately was written by Paul and are historical documents that can be trusted as being written by Paul. And what do we see in Galatians chapter 18? He writes, he says, then after 3 years, I went up, speaking after his conversion, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing to you is no lie. Here he is. What is he saying? He says, man, I went up to Jerusalem. I got acquainted with Cephas. Who did he see? Well, he saw Peter and he saw James. Well, what is he telling you? He says, we got to hang out for a couple of weeks. And he's talking. What do you think they talked about? They're talking about what they experienced in their message and what they're preaching and teaching. Galatians chapter 2, he says, after that, 14 years later, he said he went back up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. He said, I took Titus along also. I went in response of a revelation, meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders. I presented to them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. And notice what he says. I wanted to be sure I was not running or had been running my race in vain. So what is he doing? He's like, here's what I've been preaching. And he's talking to who? The eyewitnesses. Well, who was there? Watch what he says. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter. So in other words, he's sitting there with Peter. He's like, hey, man, here's what I'm preaching. Here's what I'm doing. And he says, I got the same message that Peter has, although mine's going to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. Now watch who he brings in. Verse 9, James, Cephas, and John. So you got Peter, James, and John, those esteemed to be pillars. I mean, these are the most influential people in the first century. What did they do? They gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. Well, why? They recognized that the grace had been given to me. So in other words, Paul is saying the death, the burial, the resurrection, and the deity of Christ. He's proclaiming that. He goes up, he meets with James, Peter, and John, and he says, hey, here's what I'm speaking. They go, yep, that's dead on, buddy. So we get confirmation of his message with eyewitnesses. With eyewitnesses. And what do? They give him the right hand of fellowship, recognizing the grace that had been given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. This is powerful. We have documentation letters of confirmation of eyewitnesses to the resurrection and the message of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, this is of first importance. And he equates the life, the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus with the Old Testament passages. He confirms that Peter, James, and John, these are pillars. They all are in agreement. We're preaching the same thing. So now you can go, wow, wait a minute. The message that we have is consistent. We have eyewitness testimony. We have outside testimony to the things that were transpiring by non-believers. And then we have testimony from those that are believers who were eyewitness testimonies to that. In addition to that, we have prophetic messages of what was to come that is being fulfilled. That makes this true and reasonable. True and reasonable. So what does this mean? Do you believe the biblical text? That is the question you have to ask yourself. Do you believe it? Second thing you got to ask, do you believe the eyewitness testimony? You have eyewitness testimony both from inside and outside the church. Do you believe it? Do you believe the call of Jesus? You see, at the end of the day in Matthew 28, what got this going? Well, they believed they had seen the risen Lord. And in verse 16 of 28, when the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go, when they saw him. They claimed to be eyewitnesses. They worshiped him. Now, Matthew's just telling the story. He did an investigation. He's telling the story of what he believed happened. They worshiped him, but some doubted. Even in the midst of being around in the first century, it's hard to believe that this man was alive. He was a man, a normal man. He died, and 3 days later, he came back. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And what did he say? Go, make disciples of all nations. Jesus gave them the charge when he came back. Go, make disciples. And when you read Paul's story, when you read the biblical narrative, they went to make disciples of all nations. And what did they do? Baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that he had commanded. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. You see, Jesus really called them to go and do. And you know what? They went and did it. What do you believe? Contact us. If you're interested and you want help in your faith, reach out to us. Click on the link. We will help you with your faith. May God be with you.